In this video, we'll add a few targets to our scene and give our player the ability to shoot projectiles. Our objectives will be to add a few targets to our scene and apply the shooter script so we can shoot projectiles. We'll examine this script and make sure the projectiles destroy themselves after a period of time to keep our game running smoothly. Okay, we want to create 3 targets out in front of the player to have targets to shoot at. Notice my scene view right now is not the same as my game view, and you can actually see the camera there. So I want to align my scene view to my game view. A quick way to do that is actually to select the main camera and then go under Game Object, Align View to Selected. So this is sort of the opposite of what we've done in the past. You know, sometimes we've aligned the camera to the scene view. This time we're aligning the scene view to the camera. So let me clean up my folders here a little bit, just close them up. And within prefabs, we've got that target that we've created. So let me drag it out here into the world, and you can see it there in the game view. So I'm going to position this at 0 in the X direction, 6 high, and 10 meters out in the Z direction. And I'm going to set the mover for this target as spin. And then I'm going to go ahead and duplicate this target. So I'll just hit Command D or Control D. And then holding down the Command key, remember we can drag along the axis and it will snap to whatever our snap settings are, which they default to 1 meter. So let me go ahead and move this to 8 units out in the X direction. And I'll go ahead and make this one move vertically and go back to the original target and duplicate. And then let's move it in the other direction, holding down the Command key so it snaps to -8. So they're sort of on each, 1 in the middle and 2 on the sides. And I'm going to make this one to move horizontally. So if I go ahead and hit play, you can see we've got 3 targets now, each moving in a different fashion. I'll go ahead and stop. So let's go ahead and create an empty game object to hold our targets. So let me go ahead and set create empty, and I'm going to rename this targets. And it's always a good idea to reset the transform when you're making a parent game object once again, so all of the children's coordinate systems are really the same as the world coordinate system. It's not a requirement, but it generally helps, I find, in most cases. So let me go ahead and reset that, and let's select the 3 targets and then drag them into that target's game object. Okay, now we want to actually shoot our projectiles. So the question is, where do we shoot from? Now, it probably makes the most sense in our game to shoot right from the camera, because the camera, if I click F, is basically our vision out into the world. So we want to shoot basically right down this Z-axis of the camera. So it's coming right out of the middle of the screen. So I've actually already included the shooter script. We'll go ahead and attach that and take a look at it. So here in the camera, let me click Add Component, go down to Scripts, and let's pick Shooter. You can see it's looking for a projectile or a game object or a prefab as a starting point. So let me go ahead and set that projectile prefab as the projectile. And then it's also looking for a shoot sound effect. So let me go ahead and pick the laser as the shoot sound effect. So let's go ahead and check this out. So of course we still have our controller moving back and forth, left and right, up and down using the mouse. And clicking the left mouse button, I can now shoot, or I can hit the space bar to shoot. You can see the projectiles go out and hit the targets and they bounce around. They're moving really rather slow, but it creates kind of an interesting effect here with the bouncing and the trail render and so forth. So let me go ahead and click Escape to get my mouse cursor back and stop. And let's modify the power. So the power is how quickly the projectile moves. So let me move this from 10 and let's go up to 200. And let's click play to check it out. You can see the projectiles now are flying very quickly, which is really the effect that I want in this game. So let me go ahead and stop. And let's do a quick code walkthrough of the shooter script. So I'll double click on it. Once again, in the editor, we set the projectile, and you can see how that's done here. So we have public, and then we have the variable type as game object, and the variable name is projectile. So when we make a variable name of game object, we can attach a game object or a prefab to that, because of course the prefab is a template of a game object. As before, we've got another floating point that defines the power. And then we also have an audio clip. So when we have audio clip, we can actually attach in the editor, we can attach an audio clip game asset. And of course, shoot FX is the variable name that would then refer to that audio clip. All the magic happens down in the update function. So you can see we're using the input class once again. Rather than get access, we're getting button down. We're looking at the fire one. If you remember back in the input manager, we saw fire one and we saw jump. So fire one is mapped to the left mouse button and jump is mapped to the space bar on the keyboard. So if we hit either the mouse button or the space bar, then we're going to do the code that's down below. So if a projectile is defined above, this is sort of a shortcut. Basically means the same thing as if projectile is not equal to null. Null means nothing. So if we haven't actually set this up, if we haven't actually attached a projectile, it would equal null, in which case we don't want to actually project nothing, or else we'll get a null reference, which is generally a bad thing when a Unity project is running. So we do a little check here to see if the projectile is actually set up. And if it is, then we instantiate the projectile. So there's a function called instantiate, which we pass the name of the game object that we want to instantiate or create in our world. We specify the location that we want to create it at. So we create it at the position of the camera. Since this is attached to the camera, transform.position is the position of the camera. And then we add 1 meter in the forward direction for the camera. So this is a vector 3, which would be 1 meter in front of wherever the camera is at. And then we also pass in the rotation, in which case we want it to be the same rotation as that of the camera. The next little bit of code checks to make sure that the projectile has a rigid body on it. So we're checking to see if this new projectile that we just created, so the instantiate actually returns a reference to that game object, so we set it into this variable. So if that actually has a component, so we check to see get component rigid body, does it have a rigid body? If it doesn't, we actually dynamically add a rigid body. So the projectile prefab that we created actually has a rigid body, so this code doesn't need to run. But if, for example, we forgot to add the rigid body, this would actually do that for us. Of course, it's not turning off gravity. We could do that if we want to. But since we already have the rigid body set up and gravity is turned off, this code doesn't need to run. It's just added to make the script a little bit more robust for future use. Then we apply a force to the projectile's rigid body. So, of course, rigid bodies are what open up the possibility of physics for our game object. And one of the functions that we can apply to the rigid body is add force. So new projectile, we get the rigid body component, and then with that we add force. And we're applying a forward vector of force times the power that's specified at the top here. So remember the default was 10. That made the projectile move fairly slowly. When we moved it up to 200, it started to move much quicker. And then down below, we play the sound effect if it's set. So once again, so if there is a sound effect that's specified, then I've got code that would play the sound in one of two ways. So first it looks at that projectile to see if it has an audio source on it. If it does, it actually plays the audio clip through the audio source of the projectile. So what that will do is as the projectile is moving, of course the audio source is moving with it, it's moving away, so the sound would dissipate as the projectile moves away. Otherwise, so if it doesn't have an audio source, I use this command called audiosource.playClipAtPoint. So what this does is it dynamically creates a game object at the location specified and plays the audio clip specified, and once it plays, that game object is then removed. So since our projectile does not have an audio source, we're actually using this technique, which is really what I want to in this case, because our projectile is moving so quickly that the audio source would move away very quickly, and the sound of the laser would fade. So I really want the sound to play sort of right at the point of the camera. So let's go back quickly to Unity and play once again and check this out. So let's look over at the hierarchy, and as I shoot, notice that the projectile clones are being made, and you can see that one-shot audio. So that is the audio that's actually being created, and then you can see that they clean up. Now, one thing that's not being cleaned up are these projectiles. So as I shoot more and more and more, you can see we get more of these projectiles in the world, and they just continue to exist forever, even though they've moved way out of the range of the camera. So let's clean this up a little bit. Let me go ahead and hit escape and stop playing. So if you remember in the last project, we had a script called timed object destructor that destroyed a game object after a certain point in time. We're going to actually use that. I've included that for you here. So where do we want to attach this? We want to attach this onto the projectile, because the projectile is the game object that's being cloned over and over and over again. So let's go to the projectile prefab, go to the bottom, click add component, go to scripts, and let's pick the timed object destructor. It's a fairly simple script. After a certain point in time, we're going to say after 2 seconds, let's destroy the prefab. I've applied that right to the prefab, so when the prefabs are cloned or instantiated in the world, it will have that script attached now. So let's go ahead and hit play. And let's shoot a bunch of projectiles. And then just wait a few seconds and they all clean up after themselves. So let's go ahead and stop and save our project. I'm sure your mom always reminded you to clean up after yourself. You should do the same when you're making games. If you continually add prefabs to your scene and never clean them up, they may eventually fill up the computer's memory and crash the game. As a general rule, whenever instantiating a lot of prefabs, have a strategy in place to destroy them once they're no longer needed. In the next video, we'll set up the user interface of our game.